Nice pronunciation of my name. You got it right. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, and you can tell me if you see. Okay, I need to do something about this Zoom. Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Is it fine? I can see you nodding. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's start. So my intention, this evening was not to talk about happiness, but something very different, which is the art problem and a new solution that has emerged, and I think is very exciting. So don't turn your camera off and continue listening, because I think this has the potential to be exciting. The theory I will present this evening will sound crazy, but it's also, I think, very neat and elegant in the way it can solve the art problem. So the bizarre thing about this picture is actually I'm going to defend the opposite. We will be in the position of God, and we will be looking at God's mind and seeing that we are here, and that is mind-boggling. So the theory I will support this evening is called analytic idealism, and it has been devised by someone called Kastrup. So this is this fellow here, and you can find his writings in this book. This book is actually a collection of his articles. So the guy has a PhD in computing engineering or something like that. He worked at the CERN and some prestigious scientific organizations. And then he took a PhD in philosophy. I think it was 1 year ago that he completed it. So very interesting guy, has a lot of things to say, crazy sometimes, like he has some bizarre theory about UFOs. Yes, UFOs, but whatever, like tonight things are gonna be normal, kind of. Okay, so the plan of my talk, just really quick. The first thing I will be doing is to ask the question, why materialism? So it's not going to be an historical presentation of the reason why we adopt a materialist framework, but more of a philosophical one. Like, what is the justification? Why did we choose to be materialistic in the first place? I mean, physicalist might be maybe the better choice of word. My second part will be about some principle that I have imagined, which is the mind's epistemic primacy, which simply says that what you know best is the mind, and that is very problematic because if you're a materialist, you have the art problem and you cannot explain the mind, and that's really a catastrophe, to put it simply. The third part will be about my argument, the abstraction argument. I will say a bit more about that. It's just for you to have a rough idea where we're going. And by the end of the talk, I will present analytic idealism, what the theory is about, and how I think it solves some of the problem of materialism. Just something. So all of that was originally in an article I wanted to send to the GEM conferences. Like it was in May, but it was canceled due to COVID. So I'm kind also of testing my ideas and see if you believe they are interesting or crazy and whatever. Okay, so first part, why accept materialism? And the easy answer is to save dresses colors, obviously. Why do I say that? Because maybe some of you can remind that, but it was a couple of years ago, it was on Twitter, someone posted a picture of this robe and asked people what was the color of the robe. And some people see the color as white and golden, but apparently other people see the dress as, it was blue and black. It was surprising to me, it was blue and black. And there was a huge controversy over that. And this is half a joke because I think the reason why we accepted materialism, I mean, philosophically speaking, it's because we have a perception problem to solve. And the problem is twofold. So the first thing is there are dissimilarities in perceptions. So this is what this example illustrates. Everyone does not see the robe in the same color. Some people are crazy, some people are normal. We have to accept everyone, blah, blah, blah. I'm kidding, obviously, but this is the first point. The second point is, nonetheless, we agree when we perceive things most of the time. So there are commonalities. So for example, no one saw that and say, oh, this is a cucumber, right? Or this is an apple. Everyone said it's a dress. Obviously, it's a dress, right? So just for fun, if you want to look into the debate, there have been like people playing on a brighter or darker picture to modify colors, and that was pretty interesting. I'm not going into that. I'm rather trying to show you how a materialist framework can answer the two problems I just mentioned. So here we have two people. You can see my mouse, I think. So you have two people here, and they're kind of seeing the same ship, except that there is a difference. I'm just gonna. I have a problem with the Zoom. Okay, perfect. So they see the same ship, but sheep, sorry, but with different color. Okay, so this is to illustrate that when you perceive something, usually you can agree. So we see a sheep, but we don't always agree on the color, for example, or the texture of the thing, all this kind of stuff. Here I took a very extreme example. Okay, obviously seeing a sheep as green and a sheep as orange is very extreme, but overall you get the idea. And the way materialists solve this problem of perception of dissimilarities and commonalities is by saying we're going to postulate that outside our senses, so outside of these ideas we have in mind, like what's happening in our mind, there is a real sheep, and this sheep has the particularity that it has some properties but not some others. So the properties this real sheep has is its shape, its form, okay, and this is why we can recognize it as a sheep. But there will be some other properties which are not the real properties, which are basically hallucination, okay? We're hallucinating properties, or minds hallucinate, and they will see sometimes green things and orange things, but those properties do not exist. And so what the materialist has to do is to distinguish between two types of property. So this is basically a distinction that you can find in Descartes. You can find it also in Locke. Locke is much clearer about this distinction, I think, than Descartes, but both did it. So the first type of property is first order properties. Locke called them first order quality, if I remember it right. And these are the real property, okay? These are properties of the real world, and by extension, the properties of matter, okay? So the properties of matter are essentially spatio-temporal properties, okay? So it's being something in space and situated in time. And these properties, to some extent, are geometric because like the sheep has a structure, it has a form, okay? It looks like something. And it's very mathematical if you think about it, okay? It's being round, for example, it's being rectangular, etc. And the other type of properties are the property we talked about when I talked about the mind, which are the second order properties, basically phenomenology, okay? And these are properties that come from the senses. That's a good way to think about them. So taste doesn't exist, okay? Colors doesn't exist. All those things are properties that are in our subjectivity, in our minds, but they are not properties of the real world. Okay. And this picture is very interesting because it has huge consequences, some of them which are problematic. So I'm just going to review a couple of consequences and show you why they poses the odd problem. So the first one is matter is essentially about geometry and movement. Okay, because the only real properties that things have are those structural geometrical properties, like spatio-temporal properties. If you think of a molecule, for example, the atom it is composed by are important, but even more important are the how to say where they are, okay, how they are combined together, because you could take the same atoms and combine them differently, and you will have a different molecule, okay? This means that matter is essentially mathematical, which, as I will show, is very important and interesting for science. And the surprising consequence of that is matter is actually made of abstract properties. So when we talk about being realistic, for example, or being materialistic, we think of people who like hard things, like things they can touch. But in philosophy, it's a bit the reverse. Like when we are materialists, we believe that there is a world that have some properties which are very abstract, very mathematical, and that is I mean, at least to me, it's quite surprising. Uh, One of the consequences, this famous quote also from Galileo, which says that, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but essentially it states that the word is written in the mathematical language. And this has a very important consequences on science, which is that mathematics makes science able to make powerful predictions. So when you think about it, what made physics the science it is and the powerful science it is are mathematics. When you start mathematizing sciences, you get something that is incredibly more powerful in terms of prediction and explanatory power. Okay, so your ability to predict things, your ability to explain phenomenon is incredibly more powerful once you've done this distinction between the real properties, which are mathematical, and the other properties, which are properties of the senses, phenomenology. And this means that physics is essentially a science of movement. If you're interested by that, you could go and watch some conferences from Tim Modlin, who do philosophy of physics. Very, very interesting. Okay. Now, all the things that I mentioned earlier will cause the odd problem. So my intention is to make you understand that the odd problem is something that arises from this distinction we had to do in order to have materialism, which is a distinction that gave us an incredibly powerful science, but has the drawback of producing this hard problem. So what materialism does is it strips reality of any second order properties. So basically it says phenomenology doesn't exist, it's all in our minds, okay? So we take phenomenology and we put it in the mind. Well, the problem is because materialism thinks that everything is matter, well, the mind also is matter. The mind is the brain, after all. So how are you going to explain that something that is made of matter, which has only, I mean, presumably geometric properties, mathematical properties, can have second order properties? I hope you start to see like how problematic this is. So the mystery is the following, is how can you get those phenomenological properties if you're only made of stuff that doesn't have those properties, only have spatiotemporal properties? That might sound a bit abstract, but I will insist on the odd problem. I know if you've been doing philosophy for a couple of years, you've heard a lot of the odd problem, but I think a lot of very intelligent people and people who have been working on that even for years sometimes have a hard time to grasp it. And I mean, myself included, it took me years, I think, to really understand how profound the problem is. So I just want to insist why it's such an important problem. And there are two things I want to emphasize, which are the odd problem is not a technical problem, okay? It's a problem about logical possibility. It's the problem of, in principle, can you from matter, from a universe where there is only matter, get to the mind? And that is the problem, which is logical. And the second thing is, it cannot be solved by inflating technical complexity. So it doesn't matter whether you have a more and more complex theory, it won't solve the issue. Okay. To illustrate that, I will take two examples. I mean, it's more like two ways of thinking of the problem. The first way of thinking of the problem is the mereological problem. So usually in science, the way you get a better understanding of something is going, let's say, going deep down, going to the microscopic level, for example. So if I take those clouds here, the interesting thing is, if I want to understand like how those clouds behave, I need to go and see like the molecular level and then the atomic level and understand the relationship between the molecules, right? It is typically the way we proceed. Same thing, if you want to understand the properties of wood, what kind of stress it can resist, why it burns in certain circumstances, you need to go to the micro level. So the idea is mereology is about the relationship between the whole and the parts, okay? And how, when you understand the parts and the relationship between the parts, you can understand the property of the whole. But the problem is, when it comes to the mind, this does not seem to hold. So I can't remember whose philosopher did this example I'm going to use on the right. I think it's probably Chalmers. I couldn't find the reference, but maybe some of you have it in mind. But if you were to take, for example, a biology class or a class in neuroscience, and you you will learn a lot about neural network and behavior and why when certain parts of the brain are activated, it inhibits or activates other parts of the brain. But imagine that you never talk about what this person, for example, here, like on this scan, is feeling. Okay, you never talked about that. You could not make a deduction from what you know from the anatomy, from the networks, how they work. You could not know how this person feels. Yes. Okay. And that is very problematic because you should be able to know because of mereology. Okay, in almost every sciences, this is the way it works. When you know about the part, when you know about the relationship, you should know the properties of the whole. And this is not the case here. And this is very puzzling. Another way to think about the art problem and why it's such a problem is to think about it in terms of the wrong types of property. So as I told just before, the problem is how from matter can you get to the mind, which is the same thing as saying how from the first order properties, which are spatial and temporal, can you get to the phenomenology. So it's a bit like if I were to show you like all those red balls and tell you, okay, with those red balls, can you pick them and arrange them in a way that you make a blue circle? So probably you could say to me, oh, I can probably make a circle. That sounds possible. Okay, you can arrange them in that sense. But making a blue circle with red balls doesn't seem possible, right? And no matter the kind of complexity, you could say, oh, I'm going to make a very complex patterns with the red balls, but it doesn't matter, right? Because you don't have the right kind of properties to get to the blue. And this is exactly the same kind of problem you have when you adopt materialism, because when you adopt materialism, you say the universe is devoid of any phenomenology. Those properties, they don't exist. But at some point, when you combine particles which don't have those properties, you will get a mind that will get second order properties. And this essentially looks like magic. There is some kind of logical problem here. Okay, so just to conclude this first section, in a materialistic framework, matters come first and the mind comes second. Okay, so the relationship goes like that. There is matter, or legos, the building blocks of reality. And then from that, you should be able to get the mind, okay? Because the mind is supposed to be composed by that stuff. Oh yeah, by the way, this means that, of course, matter is ontologically primitive, but I think you understood that. And the problem is that you have the art problem. So the art problem tells you, no, you don't get the mind from matter. This is wrong. You cannot use your little Legos and build a mind from that. This is impossible. Okay. And what I will claim in the next part of my talk is that actually this relationship here, so building blocks of matter gets the mind, the relationship is actually the reverse if you believe in analytic idealism. So the relationship goes, you need the mind to get the matter. Might sound surprising, but I will try to justify it to the best of my abilities. Okay, so next part. So this part is about the epistemic primacy of the mind. So the idea of this part is try to show why I think the art problem is such a problem. And it's such a problem because of the epistemic primacy of the mind, because the mind is something we should know and we know for certain exists. So I want to insist on something, which is the art problem is not just a benign anomaly, okay? If you've read people like Lakatos in Philosophy of Science, which would tell you that when you have a theory, like for example, Newton theory, and then you calculate the orbit of a planet, for example, and you might say, oh, it's bizarre, like the orbit doesn't fit. But this is a small anomaly because what you could do is to say, oh, maybe there is another planet behind the planet we see and we cannot see it, but the gravity of the planet changed the orbit. And so the theory is safe, okay? This is just a small anomaly. In that case, I think it is not a small anomaly. Like the hard problem is potentially paradigm crushing. Okay, uh, it makes it impossible to explain what makes science and the materialistic hypothesis possible. Sorry, I'm just reading the text. It's bad. So the idea is like the problem here is mind is very important because it makes it possible to have the materialistic hypothesis in the first place. So, for example, when you do science, something that is very important is to be able to make measurements, okay? And to agree with other people about the measurements you've been taking. So, if, for example, I were to read this measurement and say, okay, I read 0.21, and you say, no, I read 0.38, that would be weird, right? So you need some commonality of perception, as I talked about previously. But the problem is, if you're a materialist, you cannot explain why the mind exists. So it's very bizarre because the mind is the very thing that makes the materialistic hypothesis, but nonetheless, it cannot explain it. So that is extremely weird. That is a very uncomfortable situation. I mean, at least theoretically speaking. And therefore, the consequences is that it limits the explanatory power of sciences because sciences cannot explain the mind. Okay, they can just say, okay, we know that there are minds, but we cannot really explain why in this particular metaphysics of ours. So here I come to this idea of the epistemic primacy of the mind, which is very simple. I think it's just a point that Descartes make and a lot of other philosophers make, which is that you cannot really doubt the existence, I mean, your existence as a subject of experience and your experiences, okay? So this is very trivial, what I'm saying. This is basically the cogito here. So I like this picture because what is barred in red is the first formulation of the cogito from Descartes, which is not the academic one, let's say. And the second one is more interesting because the second one says, so ego sum, ego existo, which means I am, I exist. So the idea is when you experience something, and it can be something as silly as I'm looking at the screen of my computer. The moment I do that, I know that I have an experience, I know that I exist. And of course, if I see a pink elephant in the room, I can doubt that there is really a pink elephant, but I cannot doubt that I see a pink elephant. Like the phenomenology is real. But for matter, the things are different because matter can be doubted. Remember that matter is an hypothesis, essentially. So we have this problem of perception. We need to explain why we can perceive common things. And the way to solve that was consistent saying, maybe there is something that exists beyond our senses, and we cannot really verify it, but it's a good hypothesis to explain why we see the same thing. But as you see, it's a postulate, okay? So it's something we know in a less certain way. It is something we have to infer, and the mind is not. So the epistemic primacy of the mind has some consequences, which are simply that mind exists. And I did not put minds in plural because you can still be like, I'm not sure if other people feel things because you cannot really directly like verify it, but nonetheless, probably like it's a good possibility. Let's say it's plausible, and the phenomenology exists. Okay, so the experiences you have, they do exist. And those two things, I think it's important to keep in mind that those things are the basic metaphysical facts. So if you have no theory, okay, you're completely philosophically naive. These are, I believe, the two things that hold true. No matter what you believe, okay, no matter what kind of bizarre thing you believe, you cannot deny those two things. But, and this is the problem with the odd problem, and the problem with materialism is that you cannot account for them, okay? Okay, so now the question is, from mind and phenomenology, can we get to matter? Because as I said before, if you can't from matter get to the mind, maybe a good idea would be to try to do something else and reverse the problem. Let's say start from the mind and the phenomenology and get to the matter. So essentially, just a reminder, this is like asking, can we get the first order properties out of the second order properties? Okay, so can we get those geometrical, abstract, mathematical properties out of the phenomenology? And this is where my argument gets tricky and a bit complicated. But I think the question is yes, and it is the only way to do so. So you cannot do it the other way around. So here I come to my third part, which is the abstraction argument. So I just want to define very quickly what I have in mind when I'm talking about abstraction and abstracting. So it's not a very complicated definition, but it's just the idea that when we're doing some abstraction, we're extracting some properties from something, which is basically what happens in this example, which is you see a red apple and this red tape, and you can extract the redness. Okay, so you can extract the color from those two objects, even if they're different. So this is basically what I believe abstracting is on a very simple level. And another thing is when we talk about abstract properties or abstract objects, I think what we mean is that those things, they lack substance, they're not concrete. So another way of thinking about that is to believe that an abstract thing is something that has its existence depending on the existence of something else. Okay, so something which is not substantial and not concrete is something whose existence depends on something else. Maybe this is not very clear said like that, but with an example, it becomes pretty clear. I think the analogy with information is quite nice. So the analogy with information would consist in saying, so let's look at this sign. So this sign is saying beware of the trains. And of course, beware of the trains is an information that the sign conveys, right? But in a sense, this information, its existence depends on the existence of the sign. Because if the sign is destroyed, well, the information is destroyed also, right? But you can destroy the information without destroying the sign. So for example, I don't know, you could rub the sign. I don't know how to screw it completely, but you could just try to make sure that no one can read this information, like paint something on the sign. And so the information, you cannot see it anymore, but the sign will still exist. So you see there is this kind of asymmetry between some things which are abstract and whose existence depends like on other things, and things which are not abstract, they're concrete because their existence doesn't depend on those other things. Okay, so now I can make my argument, which in essence is saying first order properties are abstraction from second order properties. So essentially the mathematical properties I talked about, they come from the phenomenology, they're abstraction from the phenomenology. And the consequence is that they are ontologically dependent upon them. So they exist, so just to say it, like the concept of the triangle can exist only because phenomenology exists. And I will try to make this more concrete. Okay, let's just jump to the example. So on this ugly picture here, I draw on paint, you can see that you have like, you can distinguish three shapes basically. So you can see like there is this circle, sorry, the triangle and the rectangular shape here. And the question is like, okay, how can you see those? And the answer seems to be because they are of different colors. If they didn't have different colors, you would not be able to see that, right? You could not see that there is a triangle. You could not see that there is a circle, not a rectangle, not a rectangular shape. So my point is, apparently you cannot, from the mathematical properties get the phenomenology, but from the phenomenology, it seems quite possible to get the physical properties and the mathematical properties. You just need to put the colors in the right place, and you will have these emergent patterns, okay, of a triangle and a circle. And of course, this is just a small example, but it's to show you that it seems logically possible to get the first order properties from the second order properties. And now I would just like to reinforce this argument with a special little funny marker argument of mine, which consists in saying that if I were to give you like those wonderful markers and I tell you, okay, try to make some geometry with that, try to show me some mathematical properties, you could do it. You could draw with any of those colors if you have different colors to make a contrast, okay? If you draw with yellow on a white board, for example, you could draw a triangle, you could draw a circle and all these kind of things. So the argument is you need this kind of like phenomenological difference if you want to have something that resembles some geometry. And I know that some people could be tempted to say, okay, this is interesting, but when we talk about abstraction, we don't think that a triangle needs to be like drawn. It can be expressed in equations. But think about it. To think about triangles and equations, you still need somehow to picture them in a way, okay? And often the way you do and the way you represent them is through some kind of, let's say, shallow phenomenology. So using here like just the white for the triangle, or just to write the equations. So my idea here is that you cannot completely abstract things. When you need to think of a triangle, for example, you need to picture it in a certain way, which involves phenomenology. Like try to imagine a triangle, like a black triangle on the black board of the same color. It sounds really bizarre, right? It's like the triangle does not exist and there is nothing. Okay, so another thing that is important for my argument is its consequences are in line with the why science works so well. Like I said that materialism is such a great theory because you can mathematize science. And when you do that, when you mathematize science, you get science that makes incredible prediction, right? But the abstract nature of mathematics, as I explained earlier, is a very good way to explain why it's so powerful. So to illustrate that, let's take a map. So this is a map of London subway. I mean, if I did not misclick, it should be that. And the interesting thing on a map is that you don't draw every detail on a map, right? You draw just the things you're interested in, and you make it simple. And you make it simple for a very good reason, is because if you overload your map drawing everything, it will be completely impractical. So abstraction is our way as human, as cognitively limited creature, to make powerful prediction with very little information, okay, and a very simple language, which is the mathematical language. Well, when I say simple, not necessarily to understand, but it conveys a lot of information, right? And think about the fact that if you were to need a map for some other purpose, not navigating the subway, but I don't know, going for trail or following a road, you will draw a very different map. But nonetheless, on this map, you're not going to draw, for example, each rock on each road or this kind of stuff, because it is useless. What you want is a cognitively practical map, something that is relevant to your interest. And so in that sense, saying that mathematics and matter are abstraction is a good way to explain why they're so efficient, why you can make such incredible prediction, because it's a way of compressing information and get to the information that is really relevant. Okay, so just a little summary of this third part about the abstraction argument. My point here is that matter is an abstraction from the mind, or more precisely from its phenomenology. Okay, so the way you get to the mathematical properties is by abstracting them from your environment, okay, or from your phenomenology, basically. And this conclusion is, I want to insist on that. It's really ontological, okay? It's not just an epistemic matter. So the idea is, what is interesting is you can deduce the properties of matter logically from the phenomenology. And that is my point. It's not just that you can think of it this way or that it's practical for you, even if it is. It's that logically you can do that. You can take phenomenology and get the mathematical properties, whereas you cannot do the reverse. And that's very interesting. So now I propose a solution to the hard problem, which is in line with what I've just said. And the problem is often when it comes to what to do, people agree, they say, okay, if we agree that the hard problem is such a problem, we need to abandon materialism, that's right. But what is the alternative? And often the alternative takes the form of two main theories. The first one being dualism, but the problem is most people don't like dualism because you have two substances. And having two substances, explaining how they interact with each other seems like a mystery, and it's a mystery comparable to the hard problem. So most of the time, philosophers are reluctant to go for dualism. Another possibility is panpsychism. If, as I said, from the phenomenology, you can get the material properties, the properties of matter, you could say, okay, maybe let's imagine that the universe has mental properties. The problem with that is if you take those rocks, I mean, it's a bit of a caricature of the of panpsychism, but often this is the main problem, is that you're like, okay, there are rocks and the universe is supposed to have mental properties, and matter also has mental properties. So does it mean that the rocks are happy or sometimes sad? And how does it work, right? And it gets even more complicated if you have to explain, okay, so the rocks have some mental property, and what happens when a lot of different molecules are put together, make a human brain, and suddenly there is reflexive consciousness? That becomes bizarre. That becomes super bizarre, right? And in the end, it becomes an odd problem in itself, because you have to explain why, starting from rocks which have mental properties but don't have a mind, you end up having a mind for something which is made of complex particles or supposed to have some kind of mental property. So I think it doesn't really do the trick. Most people are not very satisfied by this kind of theories. You could go for some philosopher like Joff or Goff, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Goff, who defend this kind of theory pretty well, but I'm pretty unconvinced by this kind of solution. So now we get to the solution I would like to defend, which is analytic idealism. So it's just a quick recap, defended by Bernardo Kastrup, this guy, and you can find his ideas in this book. So what does analytic idealism say? So I will call it AI, even if it's a bit bizarre, but yeah, too bad. So the idea of analytic idealism is to go a bit more crazy than panpsychism, essentially. So instead of saying that the universe has mental properties, you will say that the building blocks of reality, so what is the most fundamental stuff that reality is made of, are minds of experiencers. So not their experiences, so not their phenomenology, but the people who experience it themselves. They are the building blocks of reality. So the fundamental properties of the universe, they are the property of the mind, okay, but they're secondary in the sense that first you have the minds, okay, and then you have the properties of those minds, okay, and these are the two fundamental things of the universe. And then to solve the perception problem, because we're still left with, okay, let's say the universe is made of minds, but how does it solve this idea that we perceive the same thing, right? How does it solve the problem that I see a sheep and you also see a sheep, even if we see some differences between those? So to solve that, we have to do something crazy, which is say that the universe is a mind. More precisely, you can say that the universe we see is part of a mind, a general mind. Kastrup called it the mind at large. He supposed that the fundamental reality is just a mind, an enormous mind. And I will make some arguments to try to show why this is convincing, but most importantly, why I think it solved the odd problem. So just to be very clear, because I know this theory looks really crazy on paper, the building blocks of reality are not matter, okay? It's the mind. So you, as the experiencer, you are one of this building block of reality. And so if we have to do an ontological pyramid, we will say the most fundamental stuff in the universe are experiencers or mind. So mind who are capable of having experiences, basically. And then there are the properties of those minds, which are the phenomenology, basically. And then you get matter, okay? And remember, my argument, my abstraction argument, is designed to show you that from the phenomenology, we can get matter, okay? So there is some kind of logical sense here. You start with a mind, and what does a mind do? Well, a mind does have experiences, so you get the phenomenology. And from the phenomenology, you can get this important property, the matter. So great. You can say, oh, but isn't it a very like ad hoc solution? Like, isn't it just like saying, okay, there is God and that's it? You know, like it sounds a bit like that. It sounds a bit like we're just postulating something out of nowhere with no argument just to solve the odd problem. And to answer, to give an answer to that, I will give two positive arguments to start with. These arguments are given by Bernardo Kastrup. So the first one is using split personality, which is what the picture is supposed to refer. So Kastrup makes the argument that if human beings are able to have multiple personality disorders, so the universe can have too. If the universe is a mind, it can have multiple personalities, and so we can be minds within a mind, okay? Sounds maybe complicated, but the idea is if it's possible for our minds, why would it be possible for the universe if it is a mind? And then the second thing, maybe more convincing argument, is that when you do some comparison between some images of the universe and neuronal network, there are incredible similarities. And so some people would be happy to say that if like the physical structure is so similar, why don't we deduce that in the end the mind, the universe is a mind? And Kastrup has an interesting argument. He says, imagine that I were an ant, but a very, very small ant. And I could be put in your brain and I could look at the neurons doing their work, sending chemical signals and sending electricity and a lot of stuff. And you would think that this is a purely mechanistic system, right? You would say, oh, this is a machine, but it's because you're so small that you cannot even imagine that what you're sitting on is a mind, okay? It's so large that you're puzzled by this thing. Okay, so now I want to give a different series of arguments, a series of arguments showing that when you become an idealist, things become so much better because you can solve the perception problem. And so just to go back to the perception problem and to remind you that when you're a materialist, the way you solve the fact that those two people, they see a sheep, a bit different one, but they see nonetheless the same sheep, is to say there is an independent sheep that exists. Most of the time, people who, historically speaking, like Berkeley, who have defended idealism, they tended to do something like that. They tended to say, oh, we have some common perception, but do not really give a reason for that. Okay, they would just say, we don't need to postulate that real sheep. We just need to say, hey, we have the same perception, basically. But we can go a bit further than that with this new form of idealism. We could say, indeed, there is something like a sheep, but in a different sense than the materialist. Indeed, there is a sheep, but this sheep is part of a mind. Okay, and I put the sheep here in green because presumably, if you believe idealism and you believe that the universe, which is represented by this bubble of thought, is a mind, then the sheep have some phenomenological properties which are real. Okay, so one of those people can be right about whether the sheep is green or not. And then the question is, okay, but what is this mind exactly that the universe is supposed to be? Well, you can call it like you want. I guess the instinct we would have would say it's God, alias alias Freeman, Morgan Freeman as God. But this might sound like a crazy way of solving the problem. But the interesting thing is that you don't need to postulate matter and being capable of getting to the mind. You can just say, my picture of the universe is very simple. There are only minds. And therefore, I don't have the odd problem because I don't have to explain why mind exists. Okay, this is a picture from Kastrup's argument, but I'm just going to skip it because I want to go to my conclusion. So at this stage, you could be puzzled. You could say, did we just do another ad hoc move? Maybe you're still unconvinced that we should buy this picture that the universe is a mind. And the reason why we both see a sheep is because there is another mind that is thinking this sheep. Okay, this is the thought of a mind we are within, right? And this is why we have some common perception. So isn't it a bit too much? Well, I think it's not, and I will end with that, with this kind of, with the reason behind why I think it's actually a very elegant solution. Why? Because when you're doing metaphysics, there are basic facts of reality which you need to explain, okay? The first fact comes from the epistemic primacy, which is minds and phenomenology exist, okay? So when you're doing your metaphysics, your theory, you need to explain those facts. As we saw, materialism cannot explain why mind and phenomenology exist, okay? But of course, idealism can explain it because idealism says, minds, they're the basic component of reality. So there's absolutely no problem explaining them. And then there will be the problem of perception to explain. So how can you explain that there are commonalities and dissimilarities in perception? Well, if you're an idealist, you can say there are commonalities because what you perceive as an external world is thoughts of a mind we are immersed in. Okay, so we're all in that mind, and what is common are the thoughts we perceive. But of course, there are dissimilarities because we all are minds on our own. Because obviously what I feel right now is not what you feel right now. There is some kind of separation between our minds. And because of the abstraction arguments, I think, you can also explain why mathematized science are so good, okay? You can explain why they have so much explanatory power because they are excellent way of simplifying reality in order to get to good predictions with very little cognitive power required. And therefore, when you do your metaphysics, basically you need two things. You need some explanatory power, okay? So you need to explain a couple of facts, which I've just mentioned above, okay? So all those three facts, type of facts, need to be explained. But there's also another thing you need, which is parsimony. So your theory must be parsimonious. And I think idealism does the trick. It has better explanatory power because unlike materialism, it can explain why mind and phenomenology exist. I mean, not necessarily why, nothing can really explain why, but it can integrate them in its picture. And parsimony it's the case because analytic idealism is a form of monism. So just to summarize, what makes analytic idealism better? The first thing is, as I said, it has superior explanatory power than materialism. Okay, so you can explain things in when being an idealist that you cannot if you are a materialist. It does not run into the odd problem of consciousness because there is no odd problem. The problem is dissolved. It can account for the mind, of course. Same thing for the sciences and the mathematized sciences, why they're so powerful. As I said, this is basically what I said before. I just got ahead of myself. And the last thing is that it's also very parsimonious because, like materialism, it's a form of monism. There is only one thing in the world, and it's mind. Okay, there is a couple of different. I mean, there is one type of entity. It's just like materialism, which believe that there is only one type of entity, which is matter, and matter as those spatio-temporal properties. Here, same thing, there is just minds, and those mind have properties which are phenomenological. Okay, and just to end here, I would like to thank you for your attention and just quote this very famous sentence from Sherlock Holmes, which says that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And the idea is, if you find this idea crazy, think about the fact that if materialism really is impossible, maybe you have to subscribe to something which might sound completely crazy in the first place. Thank you.